I'm now going to continue my video series on 1950 music with some facts about the year 1950. So what was going on back then? People were worried about waking up one morning to a radioactive nightmare. Communism had spread throughout Russia and China. The Korean War began. Soldiers that had just returned home from World War II were worried about being deployed to Korea. There was a draft back then also. So lots of young men were worried that they would be drafted and deployed to Korea. And that was a big worry back then. Okay? Now, fresh on people's minds was the death of President Roosevelt. And here they are dealing now with President Truman. There were 6 million television sets sold in the United States in the year 1950. Saturday morning kids shows began. Labor unions reached their peak in 1950. And Charles Schulz began his comic strip. Yes, the one known as Peanuts. I'm sure you remember that. Now, you also have to keep in mind that not everybody had electricity in their homes. Most people did. Some people did not. Matter of fact, some people still had outhouses. Okay? And I have relatives that can vouch for that. Dishwashers and washing machines were becoming more commonplace in houses. But not everybody had them. Okay? And then, of course, you had the drive-in theaters. They were becoming more prevalent in all the communities across the United States. Okay? Now, all of these facts, and I'm sure there's a lot more to this, and I'm sure I'm going to get a ton of comments on my... You can leave comments down here below. You want to tell me some of the things that were happening back in 1950? You go right ahead. You just leave them right down here. I'd love to read all of them, because I'm sure there was a lot of things that was going on back then that had a heavy influence on the music industry. Keep in mind that a lot of grocery stores and department stores back then didn't stay open after 5 o'clock. That was the end of their day. Okay? Even today, banks don't stay open past 5 normally. There are some banks that do, but not all of them. Most of them don't. Okay? So think about that for just a second. Shoot, after 5 o'clock, you were lucky back then to find a gas station that was still open. See what I mean? So there was a lot of things going on back then that aren't going on today. And even though they did have labor unions back then, those people who worked for the factories often worked 12-hour days. Not like the 8 we work today. We're talking about a pure 12-hour day. And yes, even today, there are some factories that work a 12-hour day. But back then, it was a lot more prevalent. Are you kidding? Think about Detroit, Michigan. At one time, there was over 2 million people that lived in Detroit, Michigan. Think about that. And I have some hyperlinks down here below. You can check out all these facts. You can see them for yourselves. But that all had a heavy influence on the music industry. But there was one more thing that also had a heavy influence, especially for African American performers. That's right, segregation. Segregation was starting to become a bigger and bigger deal back at that time. It wasn't a massive deal, but it was a pretty big deal at that time. And it would get bigger as the years rolled by. So all of these things played a role in what type of music you heard out there. Now keep in mind that when you're talking about the television sets, not every household had one. Okay? So not everybody back then got subjected to Saturday morning children's television. A lot of people were still surrounding the vacuum tube radios. Vacuum tube radios were very prevalent at that time in every single household. And yes, they were made of vacuum tubes. No question about it. And there were no FM stations at that time. That was all AM. That was amplitude modulation. Okay? So, yeah, FM stations wouldn't come around for a little while. Okay? And what's even more interesting is that the king of rock and roll, Elvis Presley, was still in high school in 1950. Think about that. And he wasn't the only one, and I'll be covering that in my next video. Okay? So there's a lot more to cover. But all of these things played a key role in music. Because a lot of kids back then, if you had electricity in your house, which most people did, but some of them didn't. Think about it. Can you imagine living in a house without electricity? Much less a washing machine or a dishwasher or the kind of television they had back then? Can you imagine that? But if you did have electricity and you had a record player, which a lot of people did, not everybody had a record player either, but a lot of people did. Okay? So one of the biggest entertainment things that they had back then, people went down to the record store, they bought their records, they played them until they wore out, and then they had to buy another copy. See me? So there were some people that still had to rely on live bands to listen to any kind of music. But if you were one of those, I don't know about rare few, but let's just say if you were one of those that didn't have electricity in your home, usually your neighbor did. You could just go in there and they probably had a record player. They definitely had a radio. And sometimes if you got real lucky, they had a television set as well. And then you could watch television programs at their house, and you could listen to records at their house, and you could listen to the radio at their house. See what I mean? All of this, and there's a whole lot more. And if you could think up of anything that would have had an influence on kids back at that time, then by all means, leave them down here in the comments below. Now, I'll tell you one other thing that would have had a big influence on kids back at that time, and even the music industry, and that was the telephone. Not everybody got a telegraph message. Some people actually got telephone calls. Not every house had a phone, but those who did, that influenced the music too. So if you could think of things back in 1950 that would have influenced the music industry, go ahead and leave them down here in the comments below. Because we're going to get into the musicians that were performing at the time and some of the songs they actually performed. Alright. This ought to bring up some interesting discussions. I will tell you more in a future video, so I want you to stay tuned.